Jack Callaghan. Dr. Callaghan holds a Canada Research Chair in Spine Biomechanics and Injury Prevention, and he's a professor in the Department of Kinesiology in the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences at a particularly distinctive and strong Ontario University, Waterloo, the University of Waterloo. Jack is also the Director of Research for an applied research center at the University of Waterloo called the Centre for Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders. So Jack is going to be speaking about health risks, particularly regarding low back injury, that are linked with prolonged sitting, as well as the risks associated with prolonged standing. And he'll address the question about the best way to balance time workers spend sitting and standing. So join me in welcoming Dr. Jack Callaghan.
Morning. Just like to acknowledge PREMUS. I learned it's PREMUS, not PREMUS, at this conference. That for having me as a keynote. It's a great honor to be here. Also a great honor to be in the same room with so many distinguished researchers and colleagues. I was at a session yesterday and a junior researcher made a comment about all the famous people here, and I would just echo that it's so nice to put faces to names and to see the people whose papers I've been citing for years. So as Cam said, I'm going to talk about sitting and standing. I think it's very apropos the minister's comments about, the respect, for lack of a better word, that MSDs have had. And sitting and standing is probably at the low end of that respect, right? When you think about it, it's always been viewed as very monotonous, non-demanding tasks that don't have great associations with injury or lost time claims. So I'm going to talk about it, but I want to acknowledge as well that it's refreshing and very exciting to see the number of sessions here that are dedicated to this topic. I think by my count there were 5 symposiums on either sedentary exposure or standing and multiple other parallel sessions on the topic. And I've seen some wonderful work over the last couple of days, and I'm actually incorporating some of it into my talk this morning. So before we get going, if you haven't been under a rock, I'm sure you've seen this anywhere in the world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I'm not a health researcher, but as a prevention researcher, I think we would be remiss if we didn't take advantage of this. Okay, it's brought sitting and standing to the forefront in many people's minds, including granting agencies for the researchers in the audience. And, personally, I think this is the best thing that ever happened. Not for the people, obviously, who are at risk of dying, but from my own research perspective. We've been looking at sitting and standing in isolation for almost 20 years now in my research program. And 20 years ago, nobody really cared about it. And in the last 5 years, I've had more attention about sitting and standing research than I've had on any other aspect of our program. And then very fortuitous, I would say, this posting, if you've seen it, came out within the last month in California. And when I first saw it, I kind of laughed. And, you look at it, and there were multiple unions involved in this lawsuit, and they wanted chairs. So this was standing workers who stood all day at their work shift, which is what the whole previous slide was about, was not sitting and standing all the time. And they filed a lawsuit so they could sit down. I thought it was funny. Come on, that was at least entertaining, right? And I think the entertaining part of it was I have so many consultations with companies, and you talk to practitioners out there, and to get sit-to-stand tables, they often have to go through the health system and argue they have injuries and get sit-to-stand tables to implement these in the workplace. So on the other side of it, we have all of these sitting workers fighting because of this new knowledge that's come out about the risk of health, trying to stand, and now we have standing workers that are fighting to sit down, which I think is perfect, because looking ahead and ruining the story at the end, that's my own opinion, is these really have to be mixed. And I think this harkens back to anything of too much of one thing is bad, and so parties on both sides are just reinforcing this. Okay. So I've given this talk to multiple, or not this talk, but this topic to multiple parties. So sticking with the theme of the conference, I think the last two mornings we've been asked to put up our hands, so bear with me. I hate doing it too. But if I asked you how many people think there's an association between sitting and injury, how many people would put up their hand? Don't be shy. Come on, hands up. Okay, handful. If I change the word to injury to pain, how many people think pain is associated with sitting? Okay, a lot more of you. Good. And those that didn't put up your hand, what if I said, is sitting associated with aggravating pain? Okay, is anybody? Okay, so now I think we have almost everybody in the room that was at least willing to put up their hands. And I think a lot of it harkens back to this injury model, where we think, those low exposures of sitting and standing on your left-hand side of the screen is where that increased risk comes from this injury model. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to support this, but I think where it all harkens back to is it's been told to us and it's been pointed that we think there's an association. And every time I talk about this, I end up in a fight, and I've been on both sides of the fight. So it's not that I think I'm right about this, and I would be happy to be proven wrong about what I'm going to say. Because I agree, I think there's an association here of sitting and injury and pain. But this is from our Centre of Occupational Health and Safety in Canada, and you may not be able to see it, but the last bullet box there is, can work in a sitting posture be linked to injury? And they go through some nice points and make some statements there that it can damage spinal structures. Okay? No references or anything associated with it. I don't want to just pick on them, and this was not to pick on UCLA, but it was the first one that came up in my search in their med school, and the same kind of statement here about sitting and injury. Okay? So it's out there. If you start looking at where it came from, it'll eventually lead back to this document, which was put out by the World Health Organization in 2003. And if you search for sitting or sedentary in it, it only comes up, I think, 7 times. And the association with risk is from this figure that you see on their screen. So examples of physical exposures that are linked with an increased risk of health, dangerous to health. And see at the bottom, sitting for long duration. So, I know my topic is about sitting and injury, but frankly, there's not a lot of evidence there. And I'm going to show, in some ways, from a musculoskeletal perspective, we are at direct odds with the health community that are saying standing's really good for you. I'm going to say sitting is also good for you in some ways. Okay? Okay, so if we go back to these injury theories, one of the reasons I think it's really hard to establish this association with sitting is multifactorial, one being that everybody sits all the time, so it's really hard to partition out this exposure. And the other is, there we go. The traditional, as you increase exposure, you increase risk on your left-hand side, is assuming an equal time of exposure for all those. When we get into that J or U-shaped relationship, there's a time axis there that you infer that at the low end we have very long exposures, which makes it hard to develop an injury model for this. But we know that people are sitting for very long periods of time. Okay? The growth of sedentary jobs has doubled in Canada. So 1970 we had 2 per whatever unit here, and it's doubled to 4 in 2000, and I would argue it's probably gone up again in the last decade. And manual material handling or heavy labor jobs have decreased. And this is also shown in the US in the Church publication in 2011, with light and sedentary jobs increasing and moderate jobs declining. And then if you plot this as a distribution of our day, you can see that there's very large portions of our time we spend sitting, 76, 87% of our day. It's a lot of hours, right? On average, it's between 8 and 11 hours, depending on what country you look at and what groups. So one of the reasons I think Sit to Stand and this whole standing initiative is really critical on the other side of the fence is that at work, you're there for 8 hours. Most of it is sitting, and it's a prime time to be able to make a change in people's lives. Okay? Captive audience to implement change, if you would like. So my other hat is, in addition to being an ergonomist, is that I'm an injury researcher. And so we've developed some good injury models. This is an animal model for looking at disc failure. You're looking at on your left-hand side again. And a material testing system where we just apply mechanical loads to these and look at how the tissues fail over time. And you can see microscopic injury there in the top right, showing how we can generate disc herniations by applying these low-level loads. But one of the problems you run into, and you see this over and over again in all different aspects, is there seems to be a threshold. And below that, we can't generate injuries outside the body because of the time duration. And it seems to be around 40% threshold. So in other words, the tissue will degrade outside the body before we can generate these long-term duration injury models. And these are all repetitive exposures. So we're not even down to the level of static held loads. It's a repetitive loading model. And we've drilled down on this, and what you're looking at is micro samples from the annulus here, from the invertible disc. Those specimens are about 3 millimeters squared. And we've looked at the properties between the layers and the properties of single layers, trying to see, do these low-level exposures cause injuries even at a micro level? Very busy slide, I know, and this is just showing an interrelationship between force, posture, and repetition. And at your top left is the lowest exposure there, and it's 5 cycles per minute at 10% compressive tolerance, okay, in a very narrow motion, so 1,000% of neutral zone, so very small motions. And you can see that tissue is not injured at all. And I would argue that sitting or standing are even lower than that from a loading perspective and a motion perspective. Okay, so there's a real difficulty here, and I think, you know, one of the challenges I'll throw out is I think this is prime for animal researchers with, you know, a mouse or a rat model or something that we can try and emulate sedentary exposure to see if we can get an injury model to associate these relationships. On the plus side, we have showed at a joint level. And what you're looking at here is a functional spinal unit of the spine going through flexion extension, but we've also done it statically, where we'll put it in a flex posture similar to sitting, hold it in that posture for an extended period of time, hours, and then do repetitive tests to quantify what has changed. And so that curve you're looking at is just a passive test of the joint, where you take it through flexion extension and it gives you the passive properties of the joint. After you hold it in a static loading, we started to notice these plateauing phases where you were getting stiffnesses. So where you can see the 50% range of motion line. There's a stiffness on either side of it going into flexion extension. We think this is what we feel, right? Many of us just subjectively, when we sit down, you stand up and you're stiff. And I think this is what's happening, that it's a redistribution of fluid and changes in that joint that is creating localized stiffnesses. And this is new. That's something we're just starting to look at. And it links nicely, I think, to some of the literature looking at the changes in response to sitting. This paper was published, and it was an MRI study looking at people that were sitting for 10 minutes. And you can see in the flexed one on your left that the annulus of the disc has migrated posteriorly by a lot, 6 millimeters in sitting compared to upright standing. And that was only in 10 minutes. So you get this redistribution, and I think it has mechanical consequences, but we can't get to that next step of what's the injury, okay? Okay, so at that point you could say, so sitting's great. Just because we haven't found that association doesn't mean it's there. Everybody put up their hands. I've given the similar question to, you know, practicing health and safety professionals, clinicians, PTs, OTs, and everybody does the same thing. Everybody puts it up because I think we deal with people on a daily basis that have low back pain, okay? And they point to sitting and standing. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but this is driving a lot of things, right? It's the whole cause behind this demonizing of sitting and having people stand all day long, and it doesn't take a real deep thinker to all of a sudden go, okay, if I'm not sitting, or almost none of the time I'm sitting, which had the best health benefits, then that means I'm standing most of the time. And so I constantly am in workplaces where people want to stand their whole hours. They want to go from sitting standing for 8 hours automatically. But, there's been some lovely sessions here. I saw several talks on edema of the lower leg and, fatigue in the lower leg from standing. And these are just a couple other studies on the exact same topic showing changes in carotid arteries, varicose vein development. And this is something we've known in ergo for a long time. I think I'm going to quote Jack Dennerlein. I know he's here, that, sitting is the new smoking. And Jack, I think tweeted, I'm not sure where he is, said that, well, if sitting is the new smoking, then standing is the old smoking, right? So it had problems. We knew that. We migrated to sitting because of some of these, and now all of a sudden there's this push to go back the other way. Okay. So this paper was presented here, and there was a significant correlation between the amount of time spent standing at work and back pain. So that was great. And this reinforces what's coming out. There's more of these studies coming out daily now. One of Tom Waters' last papers before his unfortunate accident reported that if you stand for over 50% of your shift, you have back problems. And then I saw some of this work here yesterday as well from Bernard Martin, that 5 hours of standing induced fatigue that persisted at least 30 minutes after work. Okay, so even when you're mixing these together with sitting and standing, you still accumulate these changes. So standing is not, from our perspective, in my opinion, and as from MSD researchers, not just a simple solution of stop sitting, standing, and everything is going to be good. So, like I said, I would love if somebody has some arguing evidence about back pain and sitting. So at the bottom of this slide, there's, if you start looking at things like combining total sitting exposure at work and at home, there's some studies that show weak relationships between sitting and low back pain. If you have certain scenarios we know are very associated, like driving, prolonged driving with vibration coupled with sitting, are a good association for both injury and low back pain. Standing, on the other hand, is an easy case from our perspective, and this is how I started at the beginning, that I think we're almost on the other side of the fence here. From an MSD perspective, I think there's a clear case that standing is a problem, where from the health perspective, they're saying sitting is a problem. So we have to come across that bridge. I think there's a middle happy ground here, and that's what we'll get at the end. And then I also found this paper and saw the talk yesterday, and it just reinforcing exactly what I said, in a really nice study with quantitative measures of accelerometer usage looking at sitting, and they found no association between sitting and back pain reporting. So again, I still don't think that there's not there. We may not just be asking the right questions or isolating it in the right way, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so I love this slide. I took it from Hitta Vanderplug's work for two reasons. One is, I think a lot of us, myself included, when this came to light about sitting causing all these problems, I exercise every day. I'm good to go. And so if you look at just up the exercise chain, so the bottom right on the graph, the green bars, with zero sitting, it looks really good, but if you go to the back and if you sit a lot but exercise a lot, your risk is actually almost the exact same at 8.57 as somebody who doesn't exercise at all but doesn't sit, right? So this is the argument that it's almost an independent risk factor, which is fascinating. So that's an important takeaway message, but the one that really drives me from an MSD perspective is if you look at the boxes between 4 and 8 in sitting and 8 and 11, there's a step there. You can see that at that point there seems to be a beneficial step down in health. Okay, it kind of plateaus if you can get into that 4 to 8 hours. Remember, that 76, 87% of the day, we're sitting 9+ hours. So if we can just shift them, 2-4 hours down into the next bin, we're going to get the health benefit. And if we can keep sitting involved, foreshadowing what I'm going to say, then we can get MSD benefit as well. So, ergonomics guidelines, another area, if you know of more, I would love to hear from anybody in the audience. Kind of one of my pet little projects as I watch these to see what's coming out. This is from our guideline in Ontario that the minister referred to, that he was involved in generating or at least supporting back when it was first launched in 2006. Thank you, Cam. I went on for a while before it actually came out. And is being looked at again now. CREAM-SD, the center I'm involved with, is leading this project under Dr. Richard Wells. But it's one of the few standards out there that lays a line in the sand, and it's that workers sitting for more than 6 hours per day, and then it also has standing numbers, so more than 4 hours per day. So all of a sudden this shift of people wanting to stand for 8 hours is going against some of our ergo guidelines. The other one that I'm familiar with is from the Netherlands, and it goes a little farther here that it starts to get at quality of exposure. So it's continuous standing, or more than 4 hours of standing in total. Okay, so it has the red light, yellow light, green light ergonomics model here. And again, if you know of more, would love to hear from you, but there really aren't many out there. Okay, so we see those ergonomics guidelines, and if I propose to you now, let's do the same thing with lifting. Okay, if you lift less than 4 hours, it's okay. If we lift more than 4 hours, it's bad. And I hope the people in the room go, oh my God, you're nuts, right? We have all of these things about the mass of load, the distance of load we travel, asymmetrical postures, like name all of your risk factors, the repetition rate. It's not as trivial as doing that, but this is what we're essentially doing with sitting and standing. We're trying to block these exposures just on how many hours you have. The study I showed on quantifying sitting was nice. It tried to break it down into continuous periods of sitting based on the accelerometer, but that's still just length of time. It's not what they're doing when they're sitting or how they're sitting, what postures they're in. You know, has their workstation been set up? Are they moving? Are they constrained to move? There's all these other factors that we're just ignoring and trying to draw these gross lines in the sand of 4 hours. Okay? So everybody go home at noon today, because your 4 hours will be up. Don't go home. Cam will kill me. So does it work? Like, is there a benefit if we start mixing sitting and standing rotation here? And there's a couple studies, and there's more coming out daily, which is so exciting to see. But Nicholas Pronk had one at the bottom here, and Michelle Robertson, who's in the audience as well from Liberty Mutual, has done a really nice study. And they both showed really nice benefits. Michelle's was in the lab there, but it was with real, I was going to say real people. It was with working people that they brought in. It wasn't like a student subject study. And they trained them to stand, and they increased standing after the training period and showed a reduction in discomfort and higher job performance. So there's a win there out of that study that's an easy sell, I think, from prevention standpoints. Nicholas Pronk also had an implementation study where they gave them sit-to-stand stations that went on top of the desks, and they showed that they could reduce sedentary time by 66 minutes. Is it enough? Depends where they start, right? Can we get them across that threshold line? And they also showed a reduction in pain. So some good evidence that this idea of mixing together works. But why do we want to mix them, right? We know job rotation was the new and coming thing, right? 10, 15 years ago, it was going to be the solution to all our problems. And a bunch of studies came out that showed it didn't work. I saw another one here about paper here about job rotation as well and pitfalls of job rotation. But from a theoretical concept, this is a perfect scenario for job rotation. The postures are dramatically different. Okay? So if you look at the APDF graph in the center of the sitting and standing spine postures there, you can see the spectrums of the postures that people undergo when sitting and standing are dramatically different. Okay? I'll show this convincingly. I know lay people often think that if I sit up straight, I'm close to a standing posture. You're not. The closest most people will ever get are 20 or 30% of their range of motion when they're sitting back towards a standing posture. So posture is clearly separated between sitting and standing, which is a big check mark for job rotation. Okay, so we did some internal studies here to look at the posture differences, and this is where my comment came from. And you can see in the top plot that in standing you have your joints all with some angle of kyphosis, lordosis, apologies. And when we go into sitting, those all flatten, okay? From a pure mechanics standpoint, the zero angle's good. It's a strong position, but it pushes stress on the posterior elements of our spine. And in fact, if you look at the bottom one, that was a study that the video fluoroscopy showing where we just had people sitting up straight versus slumping. And if you look across at upright and slouch sitting, the joint angles there approach 80% or more of the joint's range of motion, right? So that's dramatic. Like if somebody told you, you're going to work your whole day at 80% of your range of motion, that's extreme, right? If we look at any of the risk factors in normal jobs. So there's certainly the loading scenario that can link to injury is the message here. And it causes changes. So we looked at people sitting over 2 hours. This is a passive response where we put people through passive range of motion and measured their range of motion and the force or moment it took to achieve that angle. And you can see 1A is baseline. After they sat for an hour, it was 2A. They became more stiff. And after they sat for 2 hours, they became even more stiff. Which tied nicely to our in vitro work, right, where I showed you that stiffness changes, and we're seeing it replicated in vivo. So our in vitro model is a nice representation of what's happening here. So even though we don't have very strong associations with pain or injury yet, there are time-varying responses that are changing in the spine in response to sitting. Muscle involvement also gets thrown around about, prolonged static contractions in sitting. Haven't seen it. Most of the literature does not support that idea. Don't want to get lost in the detail, but this is just a summary slide of a bunch of sitting exposures, and no matter how you cut this cake, the A graph is the Janssen APDF standards showing there's clear rest periods in all the muscles we looked at, no matter what the tasks are in sitting. There's a gaps analysis there showing both the number and length of gaps are well above what was reported by Vierstead. And then the average activation is quite low, right? We're talking 1-2% peak activation in these muscles during sitting. So it's a very low demand task, which we know, right? Back. So at this point in time, you'd say sitting's good, right? I hope. Or at least it's not as bad as we get from this media about sitting's going to kill us all. And then we were also looking at standing. So the nice thing was we have a background in my lab looking at both of these before we got into sit to stand, and that really hit as a new trendy topic, even though the technology is quite old. And so we developed this acute transient model, we call it, of back pain. And we found that if you constrain people, like the literature said, to stand within is a force plate, but less than a meter square, they could move their feet, so it wasn't like their feet were fixed to the ground. They could move around in that space, but they couldn't leave the workstation. So very much like call center workers, tellers, any worker that's constrained, they can only leave at breaks. Within 2 hours, and usually within 30 minutes, we could induce what we refer to as a clinically meaningful increase in pain, which you can see here, the red dot occurring around 45 minutes in this group. This aligned well with Anderson's study showing greater than 30 minutes of constrained standing was associated with low back pain reporting, 30% prevalence in the Tissot study in 2009, and it's been replicated in Australia, New Zealand, the US now. Multiple labs have adopted this model and have found the same findings that we have found, that 40% on average, but between 40 and 70% of a random sample will report low back pain. And we can talk about this later, don't want to dwell on it, but these are not people who are low back pain reporters. Like, they have pain beliefs. We've done all kinds of psych and clinical evaluations, and they're no different than the people who don't report pain on any scale we look at. They don't come in expecting they're going to develop pain. In fact, it's kind of a surprise when they get labeled as pain developers. I think this is really important, and I think it aligns with a comment Dr. Rempel and Dr. Noyes made in the Systematic Review Symposium on Monday, that for our interventions really to be effective, they have to address a problem or a specific issue. And we're universally, or not us, but furniture manufacturers and companies are adopting sit-to-stand stations rapidly. The uptake is unbelievable. I was just at Neocon, the furniture trade show last week in Chicago, and one of the partners I was talking to has seen a 500% growth in sit-to-stand table sales in the last 3 years. So that's massive. I would have liked to have shares in that exchange. So the message here is there's your pain, right? It's in the studies, and we can replicate it in the lab, which was very powerful, and we're going to come to it. So activation in sitting was very low. In standing, it's much higher, right? If you look at these sample graphs here, you can see activation's well over 10% MVC. But what was really fascinating is the difference between pain developers and non-pain developers here was really about how they were recruiting or the motor control strategies they were employing. And so quickly, on the bottom left, that's just a pain scale showing we have two groups here, pain developers in the red, non-pain developers in the blue or purple color there. And the graph on your left with the time series data is non-pain developers. The graph on the right is pain developers. And what is happening there is they have a co-contraction phenomenon, where the left and right glute med, so the hip muscles, right, involved in sway, are turning on synchronously. And I'll show it in a second, but that's changing postural response. They're not moving the same as non-pain developers. And it comes out, the graph with the bars there is just showing the average of this association is positive, clearly positive for pain developers and negative for non-pain developers, okay? Which is exciting, right? I think it's exciting. So we can call it co-contraction because we also measured that, and that's what these graphs are just showing, is co-contraction in the trunk and in glute med, and then how it changes over time. And one of the fascinating things here, again, these are non-pain developer, non-low back pain people when they come into the lab, and where they're different is immediately out of the gate. So they enter the study, they start standing, and it's not that they are developing pain and putting these changes into place like they're responding to it, trying to, alleviate the pain. This is happening prior to pain development. And they're only different right at the beginning. So the way the strategy they've chosen or adopted or the way they move is different immediately, and it has pain consequences coming out at the end. Okay. So then we were, well, is it muscle? Is it really driven by this? What's going on? And so we looked at what we tried to develop was a knockout, to try and knock out glute med is the rationale behind that, and that's not what happened. We did fatigue the muscle. And this was a nice balanced study where we brought in 40 participants, and they did, it wasn't the way this is worded, it looks like two groups, but they did both a control and a fatigue session. Okay, and we had almost balanced, I can't read the numbers because it's small, but there were pain developers and non-pain developers right around that 40% that I talked about, and they stood for 2 hours. Okay, and the difference in the two trials was one was just a control trial, they stood, the other we fatigued the hip abductors by this repetitive task of just sideline hip abduction, and then they went into standing. This graph, you have to kind of flip it in your head, I apologize, but it's a reduction in pain. Okay, so it's the pain status in control minus the pain status when fatigued. When we fatigued the hip abductors and the pain developers, their pain went down. So we knocked out that source, okay, which was great, and we didn't induce it in non-pain developers. And what was really neat, that co-contraction that I showed existed in the control still existed. So the control is the dotted line. Pain developers are in red still. And their level was up at 1,000 units. And when they were fatigued, that disappeared. In fact, it disappeared to the same level as the blue, right? If you look at the non-pain developers in non-fatigue situation, we've turned them into non-pain developers' responses by simply fatiguing them, knocking out that muscle in whatever strategy we're using. I don't think all of a sudden if we start training glute med that's going to solve this whole problem. I think it's more an indicator than anything else, but I think it's a great marker of what's happening here in the strategy that's being employed. So that's where they're really different again, right at the beginning. Clearly, they're trying to use that muscle in a different way. Why? Is it motion dependent? Is it postural dependent? I think it has a tie to posture that I'll show you in a second. That the blue recovered as we expected over the 2 hours. They returned back. We did intermittent contractions, test contractions, and showed that the muscle recovered because non-pain developers aren't using that actively the same way as non-pain developers are, where pain developers didn't recover from the fatigue over the 2 hours because they continually are trying to use that muscle in some fashion. Okay, so at this point you're saying, so what? Right? We've looked at muscle differences. So if we looked from a muscle perspective, I'd say I'd give the nod to sitting. If we look at a posture perspective, I'd give the nod to standing. It's a more of a neutral posture. We saw some studies here, and people prefer to sit. Given the choice, they sit a lot. I know there's studies out there showing that sit-to-stand workstations aren't used to their full capacity, they're often not used at all when it comes down to it after they've been given them. They revert to sitting. So sitting is a benefit. Is this standing thing really of concern? And so after we finished one of our studies, we followed them for 3 years. And it was a small longitudinal sample, but first of its kind. There were 43 people that went into this at year 1. We had a good response rate. We kept over 80% of people responding over the 3 years on average. And what we found was within 2 years, there was an odds ratio of 3 that those people who were pain developers in standing became clinical back pain cases. So they sought medical treatment for back pain. So it is important, right? There is a link here between this exposure to standing, the pain we're seeing, and becoming clinical cases. And our non-pain developers were very much in line with population expectations. So some of them went on to become pain cases, but at no different rate than what the general population would. Okay, so we've talked about sitting, standing, the exposures that are involved in both. What do we do about it, right? We're here to talk about prevention of musculoskeletal disorders. And the first thing we did, I had a PT, Erica Nelson Wong, was a PT PhD in my lab, and she wanted to do an intervention study. And I thought, this is great. It's right in line with training stuff we're doing. And the program's here, just a basic core exercise strengthening program that ran for 4 weeks with progression involved. And we turned pain developers into non-pain developers. So you can see, my colors are killing me here. So our pain developer control is in red. They didn't change status over the 4 weeks. And the blue is our pain developer in the exercise, and you can see they went below our threshold. Okay? So by a simple training program, we turned people who were potentially on a path to become clinical low back pain cases into non-pain developers when they were standing. Did it really change anything, right? Because we know accommodation sometimes can mask real changes. But what you're seeing here is before exercise and after exercise in red and green respectively, and after they exercised, they decreased their co-contraction. So we, lack of a better word, repatterned the motor control, that they were doing things differently afterwards. Whether it progressed for a long time, I don't know. I can't answer that question, unfortunately, but I think it has laid a groundwork that this is a potential intervention. I think with Dr. Goldenhar's talk yesterday about, training programs and exercise programs in construction, I've been getting more and more calls about exercise programs in the workplace, and I know Dr. Fisher presented a paper on this yesterday about an exercise program tied to sedentary work. If it's smartly developed and addresses these issues, I think you could make a difference. Just general exercise, I don't think is going to be the answer because of the tie, right, to exercise and the independence to risk. So then, all of a sudden, we had this base level work that we had done, and sit-to-stand stations reared their head and came out. So we started looking at, if we mix these together, could it solve our problem, right? Like, just have them rotating between sit-to-stand, take benefits of the aspects that were beneficial, and try and mitigate the risk from the other aspects. And this was a 45-minute standing to 15-minute sitting ratio that you see here. And this is just the pain scores. And what you see is, our pain developers are building pain during the 45 minutes standing, and then decreasing somewhat in sitting. And what was the big aha or wow moment for me when I saw this slide was there seems to be a cumulative pain response here that, once they've initiated that pain pathway within that day or that shift, even if they've changed posture, it's not resetting right back to zero, which is what I naively kind of thought may happen. And it just builds. Okay? And if you go on farther, it continues to build. Where, to reinforce that intervention should address a problem, there's our non-pain developers at the bottom that aren't really developing anything in either posture. And I think this is one of the reasons why some of the studies aren't showing usage of sit-to-stand stations, because people just are quite content to be sitting tolerant and they don't use them. Okay? So it's addressing or providing something to somebody or a group that doesn't have a need, maybe. Not that they won't benefit from it, but there isn't a need there to really drive it. So we did a couple other studies quickly, just looking at them. The blue and red one with walking breaks is sitting. So that was just prolonged sitting. And this shows if you constrain sitting as well, you can see the discomfort levels are high there, which is why I believe sitting is associated with pain. And if you gave them walking breaks, they had 5-minute walking breaks, but when they sat down, you can see that it's still a stacking that's happening there of discomfort. And then we wondered if it was just a pure ratio thing with the 45 minutes standing, 15-minute sit. So we flipped it completely around and had them sit for 15 and, stand for 15 and sit for 45, which is the green and black color. And you can see the same thing there. The only difference there was there's more of a reset in between. When they went from sitting and they stood, there was a bigger reset, but it still built within the sitting exposure. Okay? So how we implement these for prevention is a key aspect. So when we looked at those and delved into some of the responses, this is the posture aspects. We talked about muscular aspect of standing. This is posture. So these are fidgets, so fidgets is just moving around, right? Shifts are when we move to a new posture and stay in it, so it's like a reset into a new posture. And then we came up with this combined metric of total movement estimate, where we just took the Euclidean magnitude of those two combined together. And what really jumps out in that bottom graph is that Y at the beginning. So again, postures are different at the beginning, and I think this is more of what's driving the muscular response here as well. So what do you do, right? So now all of a sudden we want to get into prevention, you want to change things. One of the points I didn't make about the intervention exercise study, brilliant idea, how do you deliver it? We don't know they're pain developers till they report pain, and then they're clinical cases. So either we make everybody do this, whether we don't know if they're pain or not, right? So hard time delivering that core training program. So we started looking at engineering approaches. And so these were some of the standard ones that showed up in the literature of elevated footrest, like a bar rail, sloped, declined, inclined surfaces to stand on, and then we did an X-ray study to document the postures. Did it have an impact? And what we found is upright is level ground standing, and 0 is extension limit, so moving positive on this scale is more flexion. So non-pain developers stand with slightly more flexion in the lumbar spine, where pain developers are in more extension, okay, hanging on that sway back kind of posture. When we move them into these interventions, you can see that the red bars move into more flexion. So we're inducing flexion in the lumbar spine by having them stand on an angled surface or an elevated surface. Both of those kind of creeping in on either above or slightly below what non-pain developers have when they're standing. And we did a quick study. I'm not going to talk about it today, but if we have them stand on a sloped surface, we can turn them into non-pain developers again. Changes the muscle recruitment, changes the posture, and changes their pain reporting. I'm going to talk about the elevated one, though. And so, made a mistake here. I think Dr. Barb yesterday talked about you always learn from your mistakes. And so right away it was, we'll just give them a footstool and have them raise a leg. The pain went through the roof, right? Because we were expecting them to stand now on one foot with one foot up the whole time. And that didn't work. And that was stupid in hindsight, because that's not how somebody would use it. So we talked to some people, looked at it, and what we ended up doing was a cyclic rotation, where they stood level for 3 minutes, one leg, level, other leg. So it was just trying to induce movement in this standing posture. And it turned out very, very well. We turned all but one of our pain developers into non-pain developers during the session, and it induced changes in this co-contraction as well. So lovely, right? We're getting some benefits without having to go through 4 weeks of training. And what you're seeing there is the dark blue line are our pain developers. And when they're elevating, they're having higher co-contraction. But in the level ground standing, you can see at times they're actually dropping below what our non-pain developers are for co-contracting in the muscle. So we're inducing changes in posture and in muscle response through a very simple intervention. The reason I talk about this one is I think it's more implementable than this angled surface. So if we're going out to do interventions and trying to get people to tolerate standing so we can mix sitting and standing, put in an angled surface in front of a workstation, has trip hazard written all over it, at least a footstool is under the desk. I think it's a more feasible one, which is why I brought it there. The last one I'll talk about, we're getting close to the end, good, is something I've thought about for a long time, and it was driven by the data that I've shown you, that difference at the beginning, right? These people are going into standing, and this population that I think we really need to intervene on is different right out of the gate, and can we change that in some fashion? So I came up with this increasing algorithm of trying to mold them into the standing posture, that they would start with very short durations and mix back and forth with the goal of trying to get them longer. Because, if can't have people moving, 20 times an hour up and down with the desk, because that'll impact productivity and other factors. So ideally, you want to get them into blocks that they can work for longer periods of time. And this was great. Same thing happened. So our control session is in the dotted line where we had pain developers. Our blue still is non-pain developers, and they stayed low regardless of what was happening. So we're not introducing a problem, which was good. And when we put pain developers into our move early, move often model there, you can see that they stayed below our threshold. Starts to creep up, though, as soon as they go into a long duration exposure. So there seems to be an upper limit here on how we should be distributing this sit-stand protocol, and not just giving an indication of, we want you standing for 2 hours, and people will automatically try and do a 2-hour block and then sit for 6, right? There has to be some thinking about how we're going to distribute this and how we're going to evaluate whether it's linked to pain response or not. And again, very nice washing out of the co-contraction or the cross-correlation of the muscles, the glute med in this case, that pain developers and non-pain developers are right on top of each other now. That there was no separating difference when you implemented this approach. Okay, so let's bring it all together. So we've done all these studies. We know some of the exposure issues that were associated with sitting and standing, some good practices to try and deal with barriers to having people standing. So we decided it was time to do an intervention study, which, if you know me, I'm not an intervention researcher. I'm very much a lab researcher. And every time I do one of these studies, I realize why I like being a lab researcher, because you can control everything, right? So, but it was a great opportunity. The university actually came to us and asked us to run this study, which was a first because they were looking at adopting sit-to-stand tables. And they had a research center that was moving. So I was not involved in this group. It was arm's length. And they were all in sit-to-stand stations currently, and we're all getting sit-to-stand workstations in the move. So couldn't have set it up better if I had designed it from the go. So randomized control trial, they had equal chance of being in either group here, but we did do some matching to make sure the groups were equivalent, and we matched based on tasks because it was a research group, so it's one of the negatives of it. We can talk about that at the end in questions. that we wanted people that were doing similar tasks balanced across the two groups. So we didn't want one group who were always at meetings and the other group who were stuck at their desks. So we did try and make sure that we had equivalent groups. Gender or sex was matched, and we also tried to distribute on age, because I saw a nice talk by Dr. Klausman the other day showing age reporting with standing is increased as well. So we ended up with 18 and 16 in our two groups. I'll talk about the education program here. So we had 4 weeks in each of these phases with a week washout in the blue between phases. So followed them for 4 weeks in their sitting to get an exposure, and then they were divided into those two groups. And what the difference was the installer who sold the sit-to-stand tables came in and did their installation standard 30-minute spiel, talk about how the chair works, perfect height for sitting and standing, but there's no hands-on demos, no individual attention. So it was what we're calling industry standard, right? We sold you the tables, here's some base knowledge about them. Maybe a little arrogant, but we called ours best practice, and looked at all the literature, Nicholas Pronk's study, Michelle's, and others, and then tried to build in our own research knowledge into this study. So using behavior change techniques, we had interviewing, we had a hands-on demo before they actually got the tables, so they knew what to do with them, tips for usage, an education talk that included many of the issues that was raised in this talk today, and then we followed up weekly to talk with them. And this was very much like an exercise intervention program, that if they had back pain, we suggested some of the interventions from our research to try and make sure they were using the table and that wasn't the barrier for them not standing at work. And they were given a target of trying to get to 1-to-1. Good news first, there was a clear group effect. At the end of our intervention, they were standing about 7 times a day, where the industry standard was about 3. At follow-up, so this was after 5 weeks, because there's a washout week in there, they were still at almost 6 times a day they were using that workstation, which is fantastic. More, I think, than any other study currently has shown. So education and involvement with these people is clearly having an impact, where our other group was pretty flat. Well, completely flat. The other question we had or looked at, because we measured these quantitatively, we had accelerometers on the desks. We know when they were moved, what heights they were moved to. And the non-use days, so days when there were no transitions, over the whole study, there was less than 1 in our education group that we trained. The industry group was 4, so almost 1 a week that they didn't use the workstation at all when they were at work. So we knew they were there. That was tracked. Bad news, which aligns, I know, with some of the systematic reviews that are coming out now, at 6 months. So they didn't know we were continuing to track. There was small deception in the study. We followed them, left the instrumentation on the desks for another 6 months. At the end of 6 months, they were still higher than our industry standard, but not by much. Okay, so it's declined, very similar to a lot of other studies that are out there. So there's a usage issue here. Again, coming back to, I think people like to sit. There's benefits of sitting. One of the real exciting things was the active hip abduction test here. This was a test we developed in the intervention exercise study, and it was adopted by the American Physical Therapy Association as a diagnostic test, and has good odds ratios for predicting who will be a pain developer and who won't. And we did this test before they entered the study and at the very end of the study, and showed that our training group had a significant decrease in being pain developers, so they were screened before and after. The industry group also had a decline, but it wasn't a significant decline. So if it's done well, we can get people actually also changing pain status group here and using the tables. Okay, it's still not perfect. I still think there's some big barriers there. My last slide here before I wrap up is it's more a pet peeve slide than anything, but I'm sure you've seen this, that if you use a sit to stand workstation, you'll be more active outside of work, right? So we had Fitbits that they wore for the full 12 weeks and longer. They were blinded. They didn't get to see the interface on the web, and they couldn't see the device. So we tried to take every best practice to make sure it was a good measure and they weren't affected by the device itself. And you can see that they actually go down. Okay. Some of this is probably the novel aspect of getting the device at the beginning and knowing it was being watched, but there certainly wasn't an increase once the sit-to-stand workstation came in there, and I think this is something that needs to be looked at by somebody more capable than myself. Okay, so take-home messages here, 5 of them quickly to wrap up. Standing, clearly linked to low back pain development. Sitting, it's a big question mark. I'm going to throw it out as a challenge. Happy to work with anybody, multi-center study, or trying to come up with a way to look at this and I think definitively answer it if possible. And in standing, I think it's pretty clear 50%. And I think this is an important takeaway message of just giving people sit-to-stand workstations. There's a subgroup here that are either a barrier to them being successful or need to have attention paid to them to make it successful. Pre-existing factors, so these motor control strategies that I talked about, there's different spine postures that are adopted by people that also dictate how people are going to respond to these sit and stand workstations. I don't think there's a single ratio, and I don't think it's a fixed ratio over time. Okay? There's benefits of trying to reduce sitting from a health perspective, but there's risks at introducing problems with standing, and that has to be individualized, okay, which I know we don't like as practitioners, that we want to have a one-size-fits-all, but we're going to end up with a bunch of tables that don't get used on top of the ones out there already that aren't getting used. So unless we take some of these issues, I think, seriously and really try and build a program of what is good usage and what are good implementation strategies to make these work and benefit everybody. Once pain's initiated, it's residual or cumulative, and I think this is a real discouraging factor, and we saw this in subjective feedback that people thought that pain could be a trigger. When I feel pain, I'm going to change to the opposite posture of whatever it is, and it's too late at that point in time, as we showed in some of our lab studies. So it's almost, liken it, a good analogy is exercise and drinking fluids. If you wait till you're thirsty, it's too late. You're already dehydrated, right? You have to drink before that, and that's the cue we try to give, is you need to be moving before you feel this pain to actually have a real chance at being successful here. Exercise is a lovely solution, I think. I'm just still struggling with how we would deliver it. Engineering solutions from the feet, I think, are really good if you have people reporting to you that there's barriers on how they're using their stations. And then that strategy of inducing movement early and often, I think, is we've talked to some app developers, and there's some smart tables coming from furniture companies that are trying to build some of this in. And I think that's going to be kind of the next generation of tables, is you're going to see a lot of this built into the hardware and into software packages that go with them. And we've kind of coined it move early, move often, so that you're getting people out of these static postures or behaviors. It's an issue when The Onion, if you don't know The Onion, it's a satirical newspaper, but I love this one. When I saw it, I thought it was the best story ever. So, it's a mainstream issue, right, when they're making fun of it. So I just acknowledge my grad students in funding at this point in time, and happy to take some questions. Oh, I knew you'd be coming, David.
Thanks, Jack. I couldn't stay away from the microphone. This is Dave Rempel from UC San Francisco. I want to dispel a myth that exists that you started with in the slides about sitting and health. And I think that the literature, Nicholas Krauss and I have reviewed it pretty carefully, does not demonstrate at all in any of the epidemiologic studies we've been able to find a cardiovascular risk between prolonged sitting and cardiovascular risk. I know that the Canadian study you referred to is cited frequently, but the same authors, when they controlled for other factors, the relationship between sitting duration disappeared. So I think we have to start with that. And my main concern with this whole sit-stand area is we're moving rapidly into wanting to promote movement in the workplace, which may be beneficial, but I'm not sure. in a setting where I'm not sure there's a problem. I don't think prolonged sitting at work is a problem from a cardiovascular standpoint. And I don't think standing at work reduces your cardiovascular risk, reduces BMI, or reduces caloric uptake. So there may be some evidence of an effect on blood pressure from laboratory studies. That's the only thing we've seen preliminarily in some lab studies that I think is worthwhile investigating further. Yeah. But other than that, I think the issues around health and sitting are being exaggerated right now, and we have to be careful not to fall into this trap.
Yeah. No, I'm certainly not going to defend their work, and I agree wholeheartedly, which is, I think, the heart of my comment when I said I think we need to take advantage of this and look at it from a musculoskeletal perspective of what's going on. And I think, you echoed what I said as well, that I don't think sitting's that bad. I really don't. I hear a lot of people, come back, and I had an episode of back pain myself this year that I couldn't tolerate sitting, but did it cause it? I don't think so, right? But it's hard to say because I certainly sit a lot, as we all do. I don't know if that addressed it because you echo my own opinion that I think the health issue is an advantage for us to try and look at these issues and come up with solutions if there's truly a problem. But the sitting evidence, as I pointed out with injury and back pain reporting, is weak, non-existent in most cases. Standing is a bigger issue. So all of a sudden we have workplaces and health and safety people trying to get people standing all day long to implement this non-existent problem, causing a problem. I do think that movement is beneficial, and getting people at work to be moving a little bit and changing posture is not a bad thing. But again, I think we need some evidence there as well.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Linda Goldenhar. So being someone who didn't have a problem sitting for many years, but someone who now has stenosis in between L4 and L5, sitting is a huge problem for long periods, and I do things because sometimes I do have to sit, but I also stand. And two questions. One about stretching in between the sitting and standing, and then standing and sitting, and doing things to stretch the lower back, the piriformis, et cetera, et cetera. Have you looked at that? For the pain developers, do you know if they have pre-existing stenosis issues? And then also, finally, what do you think about treadmills and standing desks? So there you go.
Wow. The treadmill one's an interesting one. Get asked it a lot. One of the big claims is around metabolic cost, and you're at a better metabolic advantage if you're standing. The difference is minimal. It's trivial, really, and even the treadmill desks, it's plodding, because you're still trying to work, right? So it's not like a walk, it is plodding. So I don't think much of them. I've read several case studies about accidents of people falling off them, because you are dual tasking. So it's a health and safety issue. I don't know if there's anybody here that knows more about it. I know they're showing some blood markers change with them, but my own 2 cents is you're far better to take your break and go for a real walk than anything you will get from a treadmill desk. And I think that even applies to sitting and standing, back to Dr. Rempel's point as well. Stretching, I have no clue. Everything I've read on stretching, I think you actually referred to it yesterday in your keynote briefly, that hasn't been shown to be beneficial. So whether it's good for people with back pain needs to be looked at. I don't know anything about that. Our group of pain developers were clinically screened by clinicians. They were asymptomatic by any measure that you could imagine. Full clinical workup, full histories, everything done. These were, for lack of a better word, normal people that you would not differentiate in any way, shape, or form as being clinical pain predisposed. We didn't do MRIs. Unfortunately, we're in Canada. We're not in the States, so we don't have them on every corner. So we didn't do MRIs, but beyond that, typical clinical model. Although MRIs are contraindicated in the States now, even for low back pain, right?
Karen Søgaard, University of Southern Denmark. One of our old ergonomic advices has always been variation, so really nice to show that you're playing around with that. Now, from a work physiology point of view, then if you really want to introduce variation, then the level of muscle activity that you are changing when you are standing or sitting is just so small compared to the variation that you could get if you just in a short bout of time did high intensity muscle activation.
Yeah.
So could you reflect a little on these?
Obviously, not time to get into everything, but I think Dr. Klausman gave a wonderful talk on Monday where he's jumped ahead of where we want to go and is trying to build a matrix of exposure that combined sitting, standing, and on the third axis, walking. And the percentage of time in each of those and how those are distributed and predict, risk of lost time or discomfort or whatever measure you want. It's full circle. I think we're talking the same issues. It's work. It's low demand work, right? I think with the new definition of sedentary, you'd even classify standing now as sedentary because of metabolic cost. Yes, if you want to introduce muscle changes, neither of these are going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen from a treadmill desk or even the cycling desks that are coming either. You need to have active breaks where people are, walking, working out at lunch, trying to change a culture. And that's part of this message is I think it's a culture change, not just this workstation is going to fix health problems or anything else, whether they exist or not. Okay?
Thanks for a really nice presentation, keynote. And of course, it's fascinating, all these things about sitting time, and we all know about them. We cannot avoid it here around the media and all these things. I think it's really good to hear that you're focusing more on standing. I think standing is one of the exposures in our community which is really, really prevalent, and it may cause a lot of sickness absence, musculoskeletal disorders, and I think that's really important. Though I think it's really important to notice that it's perhaps not the office workers which are having these issues with principal respect to sitting and standing. Yeah. We have blue-collar workers which are standing for a long time, for long periods of time. I think it's just so important that we also start to have these objective measurements so we can say more precisely, are you standing for long periods of time, and what is then the consequences? And it is based on the literature, it's really hardly to find any good papers, prospective papers, where are measured sitting or standing time precisely for long periods of time. So we know so little about it. Can you say something about, have you done any studies or know something about, what about manufacturing workers? Those standing for hours and hours, what is their risk?
Agreed. And that's, where I was saying, I think if you ask me which is better, I'd say sitting. The health people would not. I know Dr. Rempel's made a very valid point, and there's a new study that just came out a couple weeks ago in the UK that reinforces what he says as well, with 5,000 participants. It's constrained standing, I think, to echo your point. And it was one of the problems with our intervention study that people were free, like they were researchers, research scientists. If you didn't catch on, I didn't put up discomfort measures because our discomfort measures were so low, it was ridiculous. You might as well have said they were 0 across the board for the 12 weeks because they could take a break whenever they wanted. It's constrained standing where people are forced to stand for extended periods of time, and it doesn't even have to be extended. It's that breaks in between. And I think if I was brave enough to throw a line in the sand today, I'm going to say 15 minutes you need to have something change in standing. Oh, I got kicked down. I'm not getting another question. So 30 minutes for sure I think is too long, and we've shown people have already hit that threshold of pain by 30 minutes. So I think it's less than that. I don't know if it's 20, it's 15, it's 10, where it is. So I'm going to throw a line and say at 15, I think we need to be having something built into the cycles that they're getting a change. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ben.